So with that lesson in mind, let's talk about change control. We know from our past discussion that requirements change, and this is because our organizations operate in a dynamic, constantly changing world. Our organizations evolve and adapt, and so must our requirements. The question is how to manage this process. The answer is change control. Change control is defined as the process of controlling changes to requirements after they've been approved by stakeholders and after they've been baselined. It typically happens in two different scenarios, either during the project, after requirements approval but before the initial release, or after the project. And that was what I was talking about before with enhancements and bug fixes. Regardless of which scenario we're talking about, the process is run pretty much the same. As an aside, change control should not be confused with code change management. That's a similar idea, but applied to program code instead of requirements. Change control processes vary quite a bit from organization to organization. Your employer probably has one, but we'll step through a generic change control process now so you have the necessary background. And I'm putting that up on the screen. Okay. The first step is to identify the need. Perhaps there's a new feature that needs to be added to your product, or perhaps your business process needs to be extended to cover some new policies or something. Or perhaps you find a bug in the system and you need to fix it. Whatever the case, someone identifies the need as an issue substantial enough for the organization to invest time and money in addressing it. The next step is to perform the analysis. This is essentially everything that we spoke about in the forming and transforming requirements phases, but it's usually much more streamlined and targeted work. Some changes will require little to no analysis if they're small enough. The next step is to document the change request. Sometimes there's a form associated with this, but sometimes a full requirements document is required. Each organization does this differently. And sometimes it differs based on the size of the change. Whatever the case, some written record of the change request is created, and that document lists out the new requirements or the changes to the existing requirements that comprise the request. This is one area where giving your requirements unique identifiers, like FR1, FR2, that kind of thing, where that proves really helpful, by the way. Next up, to get approvals from stakeholders. Remember that by this point, all the requirements for the product have already been approved and baselined. So if you're going to introduce new requirements, or if you're changing what's already been accepted and approved, it makes sense that you have to get approvals again. Whether or not you need to do any socialization or presentation of the requirements will actually vary based on the size of the new requirements and the organization itself. In most cases, short amendments can simply be emailed out to stakeholders with a request for their approval. The next step is to implement the changes in the system or the process. And this is where the implementation team makes all the necessary changes, and the testing team verifies that the system is working as expected. And then finally, the remaining task is to update the requirements archive. This is where you take the requirements from the change request document and you merge them into a new version of the previous requirements document. So why don't we actually take a look at an example from real life? Unfortunately, it's not as simple as my little example here. So what you now see on the screen is the change control process for the Firefox browser that the Mozilla product team uses in selecting bugs and presumably enhancements. Before going into it, I'll pause for a second. How easy is this diagram to understand? Is it immediately obvious to you where the process starts and ends? I have to confess that my first impression when I saw this was that the top box, request refinements, that was where it began. But that's not true. It's actually the box over on the left, change request filed in Bugzilla. I'm just going to use this as an example of why it's important to put the start and finish shapes on your flowcharts to make them easier to understand. But I'm not going to belabor that point too much. Anyway, we start over on the left where the change request is filed. Bugzilla, by the way, is just a defect management and tracking system. From there, they triage the change request list. I guess that box should actually be a diamond shape, but I'm not going to give them too much of a hard time. Change requests that are accepted go to the right, and unaccepted ones go down. Let's take the accepted change request first. Changes are accepted, then the requests are reviewed by the FX3 team leads, whoever they are. Then the changes are approved. Then the requests are then sent to the products team, and then the PRD, that's the product requirements document, it's updated, and the change request is closed. Let's come back to that branch and take a look at what happens to change requests that are not accepted. So in this case, someone or some group of people, they defer the change request and close the bug. And in doing so, they either discard it or send it to the Idea Center for discussion, propose it as a labs project, or add it to some list for future consideration. Okay, so this is not a perfect flowchart, but it is a good view into how modern organizations manage this kind of process of enhancements and bug fixes and change control. Your own organization probably has something like this, and you really need to look into how this process works and get familiar with it. I'll also suggest that if they don't have a flowchart like this one, that you create one. First of all, it'll be good practice for you as you learn to model processes, but it also might be helpful to the team that manages the requirements change control process. So now let's take a look at a couple common problems that frequently come up in requirements change control and some ways of overcoming them. The first is when the organization doesn't have a change control process. This means that changes to requirements are handled on a kind of an ad hoc basis, or worse, chaotic basis. So this sets the stage for all kinds of requirements quality issues and confusion in your company. It's mostly common in smaller organizations, but it's not unheard of in a medium or large size organization as well. The best solution is just to create one. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can even just do it within the project team. And it doesn't have to be organization-wide at first either. You can use something like the one we covered just now, 7th Morning's version, or you can use the Firefox version, or you can make up your own. The most important thing is for it to work effectively. Whatever you come up, once you have it working, share it with your colleagues on other projects or departments and with your boss. And that way you'll be helping your organization to mature its requirements processes. The worst solution, if you can call it that, is to simply accept the lack of change control. You'll run into severe problems. If not during, then certainly after your project, and I think we already covered those with my own sad example. The other major problem is when there are too many cooks in the kitchen. In other words, there is a change control process, but control is weak over who makes what changes to the requirements archive. This is more common in medium to large enterprises, and especially when you have more than one BA making changes to the same set of requirements. Then you can have a coordination problem where you're overwriting each other's requirements, or writing requirements that conflict with your colleagues' requirements, and so on. There are a lot of different solutions to this one. You can identify owners of sets of requirements who must approve any changes to the requirements they own. Or you can have those requirements owners be the ones to actually make the changes to their requirements in the archive. And those are fairly easy process changes to make, although there's a little bit of a bottleneck. You can also elect or appoint a requirements archive owner who becomes familiar with all the requirements in the entire archive and then coordinates changes whenever necessary. There's a lot of different ways to resolve the problem. The best course of action is probably to consult with your boss and then find the best approach for you and your team.